Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Haley, and I'll be your host as we discuss today's topic, which is setting up your OSS management process. This is brought to you by Revenera, hosted by VIP. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Alex from Revenera, Martin from Source Code Control, and Joel from Interneuron. All right, Alex, you may take it away.
All right. Thank you, Haley. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So as Haley mentioned, we do have a lot to cover. We're going to do this in a couple different parts. So I wanted to start off with giving some context to the conversation. So I'll spend a few moments, talk about where we are as an industry, where we are with various regulations. Can't have a webinar without talking about SBOMs, so we'll do that a little bit as well. And then we will get into the really interesting part of this, where we have Martin and Joel, who are both customers of Revenera and a partner as well. And they will talk through their experience of actually deploying an open source management program, some of the benefits, the challenges, and hopefully provide some learning so you can avoid some of the pitfalls that they work through and become successful in your own endeavors of deploying a program to manage your risk. So I have been in this space for about 18 years, started off back in the early 2000s. So I have seen a lot of change around and what's driving activities around open source management, as well as various regulations emerging and now getting very close to coming to fruition. So I will add some kind of comments along the way as to where we are and where we came from, and hopefully where we are going. So let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do is just spend a few moments. I know there's kind of a lot on the slide here, but this is the reality that everybody is dealing with today. We've got massive growth in open source that's been sustained and continued for over a decade. We've got a lot of activity around security exploits. We've got lots of different SBOM mandates and general cybersecurity mandates. And we've got the problem at hand, which is what all of this is aimed to solve, which is a disconnected supply chain. So when I think about this, I always think to hardware as an analogy. So if you look at what happened with Boeing earlier this year, where the door blew off the plane, they, in a matter of days, knew exactly who manufactured which part, where it came from, which vendors were involved, could assess whether any sort of quality metrics were violated. If this was a software problem, this would be a much bigger challenge, right? We've kind of handled the supply chain issues in the hardware world. Software is much less mature and has much less mature tools, and therefore there are need for tools like software composition analysis scanners and other cybersecurity tools in the industry. So as far as open source growth goes, we continue to see developers leveraging open source to kind of get to market faster, to drive innovation, to not waste their time on implementing constrained functionality and really spend their time on implementing innovation and secret sauce for their companies. We have a services practice as part of Revenera, and on average, we're now seeing about 3,500 pieces of open source, third-party and commercial applications in a typical modern application. And if you look at by lines of code, we're usually seeing 80% or more of a particular application being comprised of open source components. So what does that mean? That means that you have control over about 20%. And the remaining 80%, if not properly vetted and properly monitored and managed, is where the risk comes in. And not at all to say this is bad, right? It just needs to be managed like you would manage any other corporate risk. On the security side, we are seeing constant supply chain attacks. We're seeing not only the volume of attacks increasing, but more importantly, the sophistication, right? This is no longer a person sitting in their basement trying to hack into a particular product or service. We're now seeing lots of investments in bad actors. We're seeing foreign entities involved. So there's lots of money going into exploits. So there needs to be at least equivalent money going into preventing exploits and being able to recover from one if you do experience one. And along with all these exploits come regulations to try to control communication, right? If something bad happens, how do your customers find out about it? How do they get the proper information to be able to protect themselves, mitigate the damages, and ultimately remediate and get a fix pushed out for their customers? On the mandate side, there are lots of different mandates all over the world, right? So we've got regulations in the US around the Cyber Executive Order. We've got industry-specific regulations, so the FDA for medical devices, SEC for publicly traded companies. Over in Europe, there's a Cyber Resilience Act, there's DORA and NIS2. All of these come from different contexts, but ultimately what they are trying to do is increase transparency and trust into whatever process software suppliers follow. and ensure that as software is deployed, there is a way to monitor, track, identify, mitigate, and ultimately remediate the items to make sure that security holes are plugged and that customers are patched and are able to continue using their software and not bring their business down. And ultimately, again, we're all here because of the challenge of the disconnected supply chain. All of this is about providing transparency, right? Understanding what it is that you are buying from somebody, when an issue occurs, being notified about it, and understanding when you're going to get a fix, and being able to take preventive measures to minimize the damage if something occurs. So let's talk about SBOMs real quick, right? So software bill of materials, essentially the ingredients label for your software, right? And the whole idea behind the software bill of material is to enumerate all of the elements that go into an application that you're either building or buying, as well as the relationship between the parts, which is probably the more important part. So if you look at what goes into constructing a software bill of material, it's going to be all the executables, all the commercial libraries, all of your proprietary software that your team develops, and all the open source components that you use to accelerate time to market and innovation. And what comes out on the right is information about what are the parts inside the final application that's either delivered to a customer or deployed as a service. So information about the supplier, information about the software components and versions used to build the software, dependency information, who the authors are, licenses, and then associated security vulnerabilities. And what is important to understand here is the relationships are really important between the parts, because if an event occurs, you need to know where to go to fix it, right? So if you have a vulnerable component, well, what's the provenance of that component? How did it get in there? Which dependency tree is a part of? Where do you go to make the fix, right? Because you can't just chase down all the leaves. You got to figure out the relationship of why that particular library is there. And then also understanding who is responsible for that, right? If you're kind of at the tail end of the supply chain, well, you've got multiple vendors upstream, and who is responsible for addressing which part of the software that you've purchased. We will be sharing these slides. There's a couple links below. There's lots of really good CISA resources around SBOM information. And on the bottom right, there's a link to a webinar where we did a deep dive on SBOMs earlier this year. So I definitely invite you to watch those. Why do SBOMs matter, right? So they matter for several reasons. Number one, talked about earlier, supply chain transparency. You do not want to buy an application like a black box, right? You want to understand what is inside the application. You want to understand how you're going to be using it, how you're going to be deploying it, and if there are no problems, whether they impact you or not. It's really important for future proofing and hygiene, right? If a company doesn't know what are the ingredients in the software they build and sell, then how can they take steps to protect that, right? So that's really important. That feeds into application security. Again, how do you fix, how do you mitigate and manage things that you don't know about? Software bill of material is your registry of everything that you need to manage and the risks that you need to pay attention to and mitigate over time. Then there's the inverse, right? If your product is out there and something happens, how do you know if you're impacted if you don't have a set of components that you know are inside your product? So impact analysis becomes a really important use case. The other part is your customers care, right? They're taking on the risk of buying and deploying your software, so they want to know that you've done the due diligence and the work to make sure that the application is safe for them to use. And then finally, is kind of the external pressures, right? There's mandates coming. A lot of mandates are here. Are they fully enforceable yet? No, but we're close. So you don't want to be on your heels the day that kind of the switch flips and not be prepared. So it's good to get in the practice of building SBOMs, understanding where you may be lacking, and continuously improving your process to just make it part of your culture and part of what your engineering team does over time. So let's talk about some of the challenges, right? There are multiple formats. Not a huge challenge, right? The industry is kind of consolidated onto three main formats. So software IDs, we got SPDX and CycloneDX. There are tools to switch from one to the other. There's certainly going to be some, we've seen data loss go in format to format. So you really want to understand, what do your customers need from you? What do your downstream partners need from you? What do you need from your upstream partners and vendors? And consolidate on ideally a format that works for you. But if you cannot do that, there are ways to transform from one to the other. Delivery is a challenge, right? It's got to be done at scale. It's got to be trustworthy. It's got to be secure. It's got to be encrypted. So you don't want to ultimately have your solution be, we're going to email a copy as an attachment, right? There needs to be a digital transfer between you and your partners, or some sort of portal where people can self-service, come in, generate a bill of material that's up to date, and get you out of the loop of having to manage the delivery. Because if you look at a large company, there's thousands of builds a day, which means there's gonna be thousands of updates to your SBOMs per day. And then you're delivering that to hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of customers. This can't be somebody's job to manually do that. Context, that's a challenge, right? There's software, there's hardware, there's AI, there's operations, there's services. How do you wrap all those together, relate them to each other, and ultimately address all the risk, right? If you do a great job with software, but you forget about the IoT device your software is put on, or the services that the software calls into, well, you're not secure, right? You can't be partially secure. You got to look at the entire ecosystem. Scale, right? Scale is certainly a challenge. Today, right, that we're kind of at the beginnings of this, we're starting to share SBOMs, we're starting to request them. This needs to be done without a human in the middle, right? It needs to be run at scale. There needs to be frequent updates, and all of that needs to be delivered downstream and accepted and processed and analyzed once it's received. Which gets us into ingestion, right? So how do you do this? What do you do with SBOMs? I'll show some metrics on the next slide, but today the answer is not a lot, right? Receiving an SBOM and not looking at it's not very useful, right? So how do you assess it? How do you give it a grade? How do you understand what are the risks that may expose you to? Interpretation, kind of similar. You need to understand, how do you interpret the SBOM? What are your policies? What is okay for you? What is not okay for you? And then what do you do if there's an issue, right? Which vendor do you reach out to, and how do you do that? And then we're close to having enforceable mandates, both US and in Europe, but there is not yet an enforceable penalty that's being enforced, right? So we're close, right? I would say everybody needs to be ready and kind of work out the kinks in your process to be ready once that becomes true. But we're right at the precipice of potentially revenue being impacted if you cannot follow the mandates in the process by just not being able to sell it to certain industries. So we did an SBOM maturity survey late last year. We got close to about 150 responses, and the takeaway from this is one of the questions we asked is what do you do with an SBOM that you construct or obtain from upstream? And only 24% of the respondents actually do something actionable with it, right? And actionable means either we read through it manually and assess it manually, or we ingest it into some sort of system that gives us some sort of grade or kind of red, yellow, green indication of what could potentially be wrong, right? So half the respondents don't know, right? Which is a problem because maybe there's a lack of training in the company on what to be done. 12% do nothing. 14 just save it, but don't look at it. And then the rest actually either ingest it into a system or manually look at it, right? So pretty low number, right? As requirements come in and enforcement is starting to be made, it's really important that you don't just ask for an SBOM, but you actually have a plan on what you're going to do with it. And really good to share that information upstream with who you're getting the SBOM from, so they understand how to best support you in ingesting it, assessing it, and how to communicate back if there's any sort of issues. Along with SBOMs, right, it's important to understand security vulnerabilities, right? So typically they are coupled, but you don't want them in a single artifact, right? And the reason is your SBOMs are pretty much going to be static release to release, right? And it may be that you release every day, maybe that you release once a quarter, but until you change your code, your bill of material will not change. But the vulnerability posture and security posture of your product will change all the time. So typically there are accompanying security report, so either vulnerability disclosure reports or what is called a vulnerability exploitation exchange, which is a way to communicate that for all the parts in your bill of material, here is kind of your assessment of all the security issues. And really this is critically important for prioritization, right? There will always be a bunch of vulnerabilities associated with components, but which ones really matter, right? Which ones are reachable, which ones actually impact you and are exploitable, or which ones may be immaterial because of the way that your product uses a particular function or a library or is deployed. So vulnerability exploitation exchange, think of it as a Venn diagram that intersects the components that are inside your application with the known reported vulnerabilities, and then looks at the intersection of what is potentially reachable, and then makes a determination between kind of red and green on what poses risk and what does not, right? So this is something that the supplier would do. They would analyze all the security issues associated with their product and then provide you a machine readable document that basically expresses their security assessment. And as a consumer of SBOMs, it's important for you to be able to look at this and realize whether this is a risk to you as the user of the software, right? And this will apply whether it's a SaaS application or whether something is delivered to you and deployed on your own infrastructure. Okay, so the final thing I want to touch on are the use cases, right? There's really four main forces that drive SEA activities, which is basically the work that is done to support an open source management process. So the first one in the top left there is an inbound assessment. This is something where there may be an M&A activity, you may be acquiring a company, maybe you're looking at pulling in a big infrastructure piece like a different operating system or a database or a framework, and you want to do an assessment of it thoroughly before you pull it into your code base. Perhaps you have external developers or partners writing code for you. And again, as part of kind of the gates to bringing that into your code base, you want to do a deep dive and perform an assessment. So this is usually an ad hoc process. It's done when necessary, but it is a way to mitigate risk before something becomes part of your code. On the bottom left, we have what used to be the main driver, which is internal compliance checks. Right, this is what has always been a best practice, right? The idea is to make this part of your shift left strategy, to incorporate SEA as part of your build pipelines, as part of your development environment for engineers. So before they check in code, as part of the build, as part of automated testing, get an assessment of where you are early and often, right? And often out of these activities, there is going to be information shared with security teams to coordinate this data along with other security tools like SAST, DAST, and Pentest to make sure that you have a complete view of all your security risks. Now in the top right, we have what is kind of the main driver today, which is an external pressure, which is industry and customer demands, right? So this is no longer really a best practice within your company. This is now really aimed at depending on what industry you sell into, depending on what your customers demand, there are expectations for certain compliance artifacts like bills of material, third-party notices, security reports, to make sure that you are transparent and communicating with your customers on the risks that they may be incurring by using your product, right? And this is the one that really requires you to continuously update information, especially on the security side, so that you're up to date on the security posture of any products that you sell or provide as a service. And then the bottom right is, well, something happens, right? It's the reactive use case. So there is story in the news. So, Log4j a few years back, hundreds of others since then. It's kind of a reactive hunt for toxic code, toxic components, toxic licenses. So what do you do when there's something in the news that says there's a new vulnerability due to an open source library? Are you impacted by it? Right. So the bottom right is kind of the payoff for doing the work to support the other three, which is if you have an up-to-date bill of material, up-to-date security information, it's a query away to say, do we have this component? Do we have this particular vulnerability? Where is it? Are we impacted? How are we going to address it? Right. So that is the use case that nobody wants to think about, but it's one of the more important ones because your customers expect a quick answer on, do we have a problem? Do we need to take steps to mitigate damage? Do we need to bring services down, especially if you're a critical application in the financial space or infrastructure? Do we have a problem? How bad is it? And how do we contain it? Right. So those are the main four cases. I'm sure we'll be touching upon them as we get into the use cases and kind of what's been driving deploying an open source platform. So let me now hand it over to Martin and Joel so we can talk about a real life deployment, real life use case of a company doing this and kind of how things went and the process they went through to set all this up.
Thanks, Alex. So it's Martin here. I'm going to start first. Just as a brief introduction, I'm based in the UK. As a company, we work globally. So we help companies developing software or acquiring software to manage the broader supply chain risk and a lot of the areas that Alex has talked about. We worked with companies from startups to global multinationals, all with different challenges. We've worked on every different type of software you could think about: embedded software, mobile applications, infrastructure software, backend software. So we've seen across all our customers different ways of approaching this challenge, and we've seen what works for some companies doesn't work for other companies. And I just wanted to start. I'm going to give 2 examples as we get into the presentation, both very different, about how they've approached the challenge and about why they've approached it. But there is a common set of pitfalls that we see when companies try to create processes and adopt technology to manage the problem, but perceive they haven't quite worked out, or in some cases perceived as a failure within the business. So the first one I'll talk about is technology, in particular software composition analysis tools. The problem that's being faced by companies is ultimately a business risk. So if you develop software and you ship software with vulnerabilities and those vulnerabilities get exploited, the fallout of that is a business risk, and you can have legal and your executive board involved in the fallout of that. Or if you've got a license compliance issue, again, that's going to be a business risk. However, it is a technical challenge trying to deal with the problem. And so technical people look for a technical solution. And if you look at the marketing of a lot of software composition analysis tools, there is this perception that out of the box you're going to get a silver bullet to the problem. And we see companies adopting tools not really getting value because they're not actioning the data that's coming out of it. The perception is the tool hasn't worked, and then they go and license another tool, and so on and so on and so on. So SCA tools play a fundamental part in the solution as a data point, but without policies and processes around it, it probably won't work out. Then we see companies without a clear purpose of what is the end goal of what we're trying to achieve. Alex talked about some of the situations that trigger the need to manage this, things like M&A activity. So one of the services we do audits in an M&A scenario or an investor investing in a tech company. And we've never come across a situation where the company is prepared with the data for the investors. So no clear report on what third-party components and libraries used in the code. So generally companies are reacting to a situation, or we've had a request to provide an SBOM, and then there's panic about how do we do that. And some companies are looking at it from a compliance perspective. Some people within a company are looking at it from a security perspective. So no clear purpose. The other thing that we find is a lack of consistent knowledge, particularly related to open source licenses, about the different obligations for different licenses. The term open source is used generically, but there is a spectrum of obligations across all the different open source licenses. And we find within one business, different people would have different opinions about what the obligations and how you can use certain license components within the software they're building. And that causes an issue. No defined roles and responsibilities. So companies adopt SCA tools and they get visibility of licenses in their code. Nobody knows what to do next. So how do we escalate? Or you get a request in from a customer or a partner about, do you use a certain component in your software developments, and just nobody's taking responsibility for that. So again, you get failure. And then the big one is lack of policy and process. And I'm going to talk about two examples of policy and process as we get into the future slides. And the final one is lack of executive sponsorship. A lot of companies that come to us, there's people or departments within companies who see the problem and try to resolve the problem, but they lack investment and lack executive support. So when they try to get budget to grow a program to manage the software supply chain without that executive sponsorship, generally it kind of just dies away because they don't get the support of the business. So these are the common things that you find. So I'm going to go into the first example. So this is an extreme example compared to the next one. So this is a multinational company, a well-known brand name, and they set out with a program to be 100% compliant with open source licenses. They have a separate part of their business works with security in the supply chain. This particular project was fully focused on license compliance, and had a number of reasons and motivations for wanting to be compliant with open source licenses. First of all, the ethos of the business is to do the right thing and be ethical. So they wanted to accurately give attribution to any open source they used, but also as a brand named company, they had a concern about their reputation. Increasingly, they are developing software and they don't want their reputation to be negatively impacted by any challenges related to the misuse of open source software or not giving attribution to a piece of software they've used to build a solution. So they set out on this program, and it's been over a number of years this has evolved, and it's to create automation and enable companies to be able to parts of the company to be able to self-manage as much as possible and not be a restriction to software development and creativity. So first of all, on the right hand side, under the support and oversight, the first thing they did was create what's called an open source program office, OSPO. Now OSPOs are becoming a very popular thing to implement in companies that develop software. I've just come back from the Open Source Summit Europe, and there's a whole stream about OSPOs with different companies presenting about what they do as an OSPO, and all very similar to the process I'm going to talk about with this particular company. So the OSPO is representatives from different parts of the organization, so legal, engineering, so representatives from product teams, finance involved, commercial, people who are out there selling the solutions that we're talking about. And so they come together to define things like policies, create training content, create websites with information to enable developers to be able to look up things and research things themselves without having to escalate things, and then keep the escalation traffic down as much as possible. Now, when they started, when they had very little automation, so they did start actually with a SCA tool and developers are scanning code, and that just created a lot of traffic in questions about licenses. So what's the obligation of this license? Can I use this license in my code? And that caused a backlog with people trying to address that in the OSPO. So a piece of work was set out in order to automate the decision-making process and, as much as possible, enable the engineering teams to be able to do that themselves. So moving to the left-hand side of the screen now, under the product teams, the first thing that was created was a component database. Now, with the component database, it's not the code of the components. It's basically data related to any component, package, library that appears or developers want to use in building a solution. And for every version of a component, they have data on the source of the source code. So, so things like GitHub links, the exact copyright statements or authors related to that particular version of that component, and also any other data related to the license associated with that component. So it's the metadata related to licensing and compliance. So as that database has grown, when engineers are building a solution, if they're looking to use, it could be a big package or it could be a small component, they can research that database, understand what the license is, understand what the copyright is. And if, for instance, for that particular project, there's no way they want to disclose source code, then they could discount certain pieces of software that they were thinking of using if they had copyleft licenses, for instance. And that database plays another role further down into the process. So then the next stage is when SCA kicks in, when they're looking to release an application to end users, whether it's external or within the business, they perform an audit of the code. And at that point, a policy is applied to the output. And if the SBOM that's generated passes the policy check, it then goes into the middle database, which is an SBOM database. Now, every individual component that appears in an SBOM is then cross-referenced against the component database. that is for accuracy of copyright information, license information. If there was a component in the SBOM which wasn't in the component database, then researchers would research those components and either approve or reject them, and they would be added to the database for future checks. So presuming the SBOM passes all those checks, they will then have accurate information of copyright, license, and then the next database is, which is quite interesting, is a license obligation database. So, this is where companies that buy tools fail when it comes to licensing, is we find all these licenses, but what's the obligations and how do I deal with the obligations? So created this license obligation database, which would take the SBOM data and give a report back to the engineering teams of the licenses, the license notices with accurate copyright information. If they're in a project where they're going to disclose source code, there's a structured way the company does that, and all the artifacts they need in order to meet the obligations are then sent back to the engineering team, and they can finish their projects. So there's a lot of automation in there. As that component database grows, then the traffic of escalations for approvals becomes less and less and less. And ultimately, they will just be dealing with incremental or new components with new licenses that are coming into the marketplace. So yeah, so that's it's got a simplified view of quite a complex process that's been developed over a number of years, but that is a good, robust license compliance process. Now, I'm going to move on to another example, which is another extreme, which is not a global company, but a smaller company. And I'm going to bring in Joel from Interneuron, who we've worked with for a number of years. So Joel, do you want to just start with, to get a bit of background about, from your perspective, what is the challenge that you're trying to address? And then I'll talk about how we worked with you to deal with that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. So my name is Joel Retnasothi. I'm Managing Director of Interneuron. Interneuron is a 7-year-old software company that provides software, open source software as a service, but importantly, we provide open source software as a medical device. My background stretches 20 years in healthcare technology, and before that I was a practicing clinician and a surgeon. So Interneuron's business model has changed over the years. We've moved from a not-for-profit entity, but then we've had to transition to a different corporate vehicle as we've started to grow and get more customers. But during the development phase of our software, two things were really, really important for us to establish ourselves in the market. First was quality, proper management and testing of software components, both internal and external. And then second is security, which is really important in healthcare. So there have been a number of high-profile incidents within healthcare where, as you've heard from Alex before, there are bad actors who are increasingly sophisticated, who are trying to access data that we manage on behalf of our customers. And so establishing trust with our customers is essential. Our business model effectively depends on trust. We use our SBOMs and our open source approach to show transparency with our customers. And that's designed primarily to build trust. Our customers also, by using the software bill of materials that we're able to access now, we've gone down this process that Martin will talk you through. They don't even need to come to us to find out whether or not a particular vulnerability is present in the software that we provide for them. They can look for themselves because we provide the SBOMs to them. Just want to quickly, briefly touch on some of the unexpected benefits of going down this path. So not only do we have a better handle on our components from both a quality and a security perspective, but it's also we sell to customers through who are other businesses, usually governments or regulated private sector organizations, and there's usually a procurement. And so Alex was mentioning that this is about to become legislation in the US and the EU. I suspect it will become legislation in most countries. What might either precede that or be close or happen at the same time, is that this becomes a procurement requirement. So as more companies adopt these standards, it becomes a differentiator for our business. So there is a commercial value for us doing this as well, is that it allows us to distinguish ourselves, to differentiate ourselves during a competitive procurement process. But it's definitely been quite a journey that we've been on, and yeah, I would absolutely recommend getting a partner to help you through this process, because as Martin said, it's not just about the software, it's about the process that you establish. So Martin, perhaps I can pass back to you to discuss some of that.
Yeah, sure. Joel, it's worth saying as well, when we first met, the term SBOM was quite a niche term. There wasn't all the regulations that Alex talked about earlier. People weren't screaming out for SBOMs at all, to say the least. Alex, do you want to move on to the next slide, and I'll quickly give a bit of history of how it works in Inspiron. So as Joel said, Inspiron in the health space, and in the UK, we've been working with a NHS, National Health Service, open source group who were trying to increase the adoption of open source in the NHS for many reasons, more efficient, avoid vendor lock-in and things like that. And we've had this structured training course, which we put under the banner of Get Right with Open Source, which we were offering out to their members. And I got introduced into Neuron, and we organised a training session with the management team. Went through, we go through all the issues about licensing obligations and the benefits of managing it, and that kind of evolved then into workshops about, well, actually, at the time they were a startup, so that they were kind of competing with more established businesses. How could they demonstrate to potential customers that they've got quality software? And between us, we took the view that, well, if we started giving transparency in what they're developing, the context around kind of competitive advantage at the time, some of the open source solutions were being developed were developer driven with no particular mindfulness of license compliance or security. It was more about the fact it's open, therefore it's good. And so we worked on a strategy about, well, how do we help Interneuron get over that hurdle as a startup? And also back then there's very little kind of industry best practice about supply chain management, and there weren't particularly any standards. But around that time, a project called OpenChain was started by the Linux Foundation, and I was introduced into a guy called Shane Coughlin, who started that. He's still very much involved. It's quite a big program now. A lot of you on the call might be aware of that. They've created 2 ISO standards now. So we took the decision, let's adopt that best practice. So we moved from just being aware and education into creating a policy. And a policy is in a way is a very grandiose word for a guide of the do's and don'ts for their engineering teams. So, you know, what licenses are acceptable and don't conflict with the overall business objective of Interneuron. So what can be used in any situation, what needs to be double checked, what can never be used, and we create that policy. And then we needed accurate data. So this is where software composition analysis comes in, and we implemented Code Insight and managed a Code Insight instance for Interneuron and integrated it with their build environment, applied the policy within Code Insight. So on a day-to-day management, developers could self-manage. We created training programs which are a lot shorter than the original training about the policy for the developers. Why is there a policy? What's the benefits to the policy? And how do they work within that policy? So now got data. And then every time Interneuron release a version to their customers or to the public on GitHub, then we could come in as an independent consultancy and create a report. So a time-stamped bill of materials, and we also do a document similar to when we're doing a code audit that says at this date and time, this is the software composition of Inspiron's code, and a report on security and a report on licensing. And with all those elements in place, actually, Inspiron are then conformance with OpenChain, which in the first instance wasn't yet a standard, but now ISO 5230 is a standard, and it is a this journey is a case study on that program. And I suppose the reason for the two examples I've given, you've got a global company with very complex processes and loads of software, and you've got Inspiron, who we started working with as a startup. And I think, Joel, I remember at the beginning, you were competing for a project, and you're down to the short list, and nowhere in the request for proposal did it talk about managing open source, just talked about open source. And I seem to remember suggesting go to the procurement and say you could provide a software bill of materials and your OpenChain conformant, and then we had to explain what that meant. But then the other bidders couldn't do that, and so it gave you a bit of an edge. I believe that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really does demonstrate a level of professionalism which I think our customers expect. Open source is one of those things where a lot of products that don't, they're not open, but they're using open source code behind the scenes. So open source is ubiquitous in healthcare as well as anywhere else. But the few companies that are overtly or explicitly open source don't have sometimes don't have quite the professional reputation that the competitors do. So this allowed us to demonstrate quite clearly how seriously we took the issue of both quality and security with our customers, and a level of transparency, which I think was highly effective when it came to answering that very simple question. Are you open source? It was quite they weren't asking too much. And again, I think that's something that's quite likely to change quite soon. These are the sorts of questions I expect to become more routine going forward.
Yeah. And Alex, if you go to the next slide, it's just sort of another way to kind of view, the overall program that was put in place. So you got the policy, which is overarches everything. So it's kind of the rules of engagement, if you like, and escalation points and SLAs for dealing with security vulnerabilities. And the thing about policies, they're not a point in time policy. Policies are living, breathing documents. You get new licenses, new challenges. Like you got a challenge now with AI generated code. In the past few weeks, Elasticsearch added AGPL to their license choice. So you've got to keep evolving open source policy, but that's maintain policy. And into the I got code on GitHub, but like I said, in the bottom right corner, every release will have a time-stamped report. So if a customer came back and said, we want to know if in version 5.2.1 of your products you had this component, they will be able to reference back into that history, and then we can provide, because we're maintaining the SCA, we can provide an independent report, management report. What's changed in the past month, 6 months? What new vulnerabilities have they been resolved, and things like that. And ultimately, they can use the badge that they're ISO 5230 conformant. And if you go to the OpenChain website, you can see what companies have conformed. You've got big companies, small companies. Microsoft, Google are involved, and their conformance. And you've got companies the size of Inspiron. And I think the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter the size of your organization. If you develop software, then you will get challenged now for more transparency in your code. And what we're seeing, regardless of regulation, is procurement, particularly in larger companies, are saying, if you want to supply software to us, you've got to provide a software bill of materials. And I think that will have more influence on the adoption of software bill of materials than the regulation, because it's going to be commercially restrictive to a lot of software companies. So that's the way I would finish. We could wrap up with some summary points, couldn't we, Alex?
Okay, thank you both. And again, please submit any questions you have specifically to this use case or in general to anything we've covered. So we want to leave with kind of steps to take now, right? It's always kind of make sure we drive to some key takeaways. And a couple of things that I definitely wanted to touch upon for what Martin and Joel talked about is, so policy is critical, right? If you do not have a policy, then you have no way to measure good or bad. And a policy is not just kind of, here's a good list of licenses, here's a bad list of licenses, but your policy over time needs to evolve in the process as well. So how often do we scan? How deep do we scan? What do we scan? What do we not scan? What happens if we find an issue? What are the roles, responsibilities? Who's involved? How do you escalate? So your policy may start with kind of very simple concept of here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed. But you really want to grow it to basically be the document that's driving all of your OSPO activities. And speaking of OSPO, that's probably the second most critical part. And maybe, you start with kind of a tiger team that evolves into an OSPO. But the really important need for that group is, as regulations evolve, as your customers demand more, or more importantly, as their demands change, your OSPO is going to be the most educated team on site that can determine how to adjust the process to conform to that, right? Otherwise, you're dealing with a bunch of disparate, product teams all working in their kind of little bubble, not really being governed by an overarching process or policy. So really important for OSPO to have all the stakeholders involved, including, legal, security, procurement in a lot of cases, right? If you're buying software and you're asking for SBOMs, well, that all needs to feed into one process. You want everything sitting in a single database, single view, single repository, so you can address risks both for what you're buying, deploying, as well as the software you build. Okay, so I wanted to close with these 6 steps. So kind of how do you get started, right? So first is understand your ingestion process, meaning, do you have rules and regulations in place today, right? Do you have a policy in place? Do you allow developers to source components from anywhere? Do you restrict locations? Do you restrict repositories? Is there a process for them to get a yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down on, I'd like to use a component, am I allowed to do it? Martin talked about this concept of a kind of a golden repository, right? Over time, you collect and store all of your analysis data, which should greatly reduce the effort next time through if somebody else wants to use a similar component, or maybe somebody's just hunting for a component to do a particular function. Having a repository of everything that's been approved in the past will help you consolidate, so you don't end up with 8 different technologies for the same, for the same issue. Collaborate cross-functionally, right? This is critical. Get everybody involved. Get your legal team involved. They're going to have requirements. Get your security team involved, your engineering team. Make sure procurement's in place. If you have any sort of operations team or engineering operations that set processes, make sure they're involved. Train your people, right? Initially, engineering is going to look at this as a big burden, right? They're going to look at it as yet another thing they have to do. This needs to be treated with the exact same priority and urgency as any defect or any customer request, right? It's going to be up to your product management team, your product owners to prioritize accordingly. But security and remediation for license sake can't be a second-class citizen. It has to be treated as seriously as everything else going into your funnel. And then it's just a matter of prioritizing based on your business needs and your customer commitments, and treating this just like any other bug that has been filed in the system or an enhancement request. Martin talked about SCA tooling. Absolutely invest in SCA tooling, but don't do it in a vacuum. Don't just buy a tool, throw it over the wall to engineering, have them run it, and think that that's going to solve all your problems, right? Tooling needs to be selected based on your criteria and your desired outcomes. So you got to kind of match that up with the capabilities that the tooling provides, but it needs to be a part of a larger process, right? You need to understand inputs and outputs of the tool, what it can do, what it can't do. Maybe you need multiple vendors involved, multiple tools, and how are you going to play nicely with others, right? An SCA tool doesn't solve all your problems. There's going to be lots of other security tools. How do they all interact together? How do they integrate? How do you plug ML into your pipeline process so there's not manual processes in the middle? All of that needs to be considered when you're picking your tooling. And then as part of that, don't run this in a vacuum, right? Make sure it's plugged into all the other systems. Make sure it's part of your build. Make sure it's plugged into your defect tracking system. Make sure it has a way to scan the right stuff at the right time, and that somebody's looked into, are you scanning too much, too little, making sure that your results make sense, right? So doing this early and often enable developers to maybe do this in the IDE before they check in code and create an issue, right? The more information you have earlier in the right hands, the easier it's going to be to fix it. You've got the same developer that introduced the problem that can fix it immediately, and will certainly be much less disruptive to your process than finding something last minute or once an application is actually delivered to customers. It can be a lot more effort and cost to remediate it at that point. And just start building SBOMs, right? If you haven't built one yet, start building it. There's lots of tools out there to do it. You don't have to necessarily make a huge financial investment to get started. There's lots of free tools as well. Get into the habit of doing this, assess it, continuously improve, and make sure that you're asking your vendors for their SBOMs, and that you have plans on what you're going to do with them when you get them. All right, so those are kind of the steps to take now. I'm happy to take any additional questions. I see that we got a few here, so let me look through the list here. So there's a question, I guess, Joel, for you and Martin, on which stakeholders were involved and which were kind of the most difficult to roll into the process, satisfy, and any tips on why.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for a small organization, I guess it depends on your organization, but we had the advantage of this being a top-down sort of implementation. So we'd met with Martin, and the board had seen the value, the leadership had seen the value of this. You've got really important engineers who are used to working in a certain way. We have really important deadlines we need to hit. So the difficult bit is managing the cultural and process change. So healthcare software, it is a reasonably regulated environment. So we had a quality management system that we were following. So this was the challenge was making sure that we were adding to what we'd already built. I can definitely imagine other industries or consumer less mission critical software where trying to get your engineers to actually adhere to the processes you want them to being much harder. For me, I'd say cultural change in terms of your quality management system would have been the hardest change. I don't know, Martin, whether you've got a view on that.
The biggest challenge that I see in that is there's always this fear, and Joel touched on it, that anything you do in this space will delay release of software, and there's a big fear of doing that. You need to get in large companies like CTO, CIO, somebody who's at the board level bought into it, because there will be need for investment as well. So if you're going to invest in processes and tools, create an OSPOs. So OSPOs are generally made up of people where it's not their full-time job, so it's part of their job. And so you're taking somebody away from another task. That's always a challenge. And the pushback that I often hear is, well, it hasn't been a problem up until now. Give me an example of a legal case and things like that. But definitely over the past 12 months, there's been a shift because of the regulations, and increasingly I'm getting questions coming in. Oh, we've been asked to supply an SBOM. What do we do? And that's changing the mindset for sure. Yeah.
Thank you both. And there was a question in the chat that Joel responded to, but I want to kind of offer my thoughts as well. So question was essentially, for a small company, what's the value of working on SBOMs when you don't have the resources to necessarily deal with things you find? So kind of two thoughts. Number one, hopefully you're not always going to be a small company. So it's much easier to start when you're small and you have a product or a small team versus waiting till you've got, multiple teams, multiple geographies, different regulations around the world. So even though you may not share your SBOM, just getting kind of the culture and process in place of it just being a standard byproduct of your process will pay off later, right? If there's any sort of future acquisition activities, you're ready to go. I mean, to Martin's point, no one's ever ready with docs. Well, you could be the first. But also it just, minimize your risk and get this in the in the process of your organization when it's still feasible to do so. Because later on, what you end up dealing with is a massive amount of technical and security debt. And now you're starting to get into roadmap conflicts. And what do? Do we upgrade components and fix vulnerabilities? Do we build features we promise customers? If you had a process in the beginning and you followed it, even though you may not be sharing the outcome of the SBOM, you're burning these off as you go. So you're not going to accumulate as much debt over time.
Yeah, Alex, I'd just like to add, the other thing is that I find is a lot of fear. So look at the code and fear of what's going to be found, and a fear that it's going to make the developer look like they're a bad developer. And so you get a lot of resistance from developers when you start trying to implement these sorts of programs. The way to address that is we talked about training. We always train with the objective of this is making you a better developer. And also, if they understand why this is important, then they're more likely to be less fearful. But we do see that kind of fear factor coming in and defensiveness.
Absolutely. Another question around resources. So I just posted a link to a case study on interneuron. Somebody had asked previously if there's a white paper case study. I also posted a link to OpenChain, and then we will share the slides that we went through after the webinar. One other question I see here is, how do you get remediation work prioritized for engineering given roadmap commitments and other technical debt? Yeah, good question. Always a challenge. The main thing that I rely on is training, and not just training of here's what you need to do, but why. Martin talked about having executive sponsorship. That's critical because this needs to be tied to something, right? It needs to be tied to some sort of top-down initiative at a company around quality programs, security mitigation, customer trustworthiness, but it needs to be tied to something that's measurable and something that people are being held accountable for at the top of the company. Otherwise, it's going to become a pet project for a team in an organization. So if this is something that's going to grow over time and something where multiple teams are going to be involved, it's got to have top-down support. How do you prioritize, make sure engineers are trained to understand, number one, that this is to their benefit because it's going to minimize disruptions in the future. Also, they're going to be pulled off of innovative work to deal with customer feedback, right? To deal with the fact that you got to go upgrade a component, which means you can't get to the feature you want to work on. So the more you handle as just part of your overall process, the less you're going to have to deal with downstream. And again, the most important part is just having engineering understand the why, right? That it's not just another thing they're burdened with, but it actually contributes to a better relationship with your customers and your partners and lets you focus on your core competencies rather than bug hunting later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, I'll just add, senior management or the top-down approach, it's really an appreciation of risk management. Like what you're managing here is it's going to save you time, it's going to save you money, it's going to save your reputation. And you only need one of these incidents to happen. So this has happened in healthcare for the industry to wake up to that.
Yep, and reputations are hard to recover, so definitely you do not want to forget about that one. Okay, looks like we have a minute. Any final questions before we close it up? Okay, Haley, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex, Martin, and Joel for today's presentation. It was a jam-packed agenda with really great information. I want to go ahead and thank everyone for attending as well. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Thanks so much, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a fabulous weekend to come.